So today's lesson is on the history of pandemics. And you might be asking, well, what is a pandemic? A pandemic is a widespread disease or epidemic that happens in a large space. It may take up just one area particularly. It might travel all over the world. And pandemics are not something new, but we are indeed in one right now. But they've been around since back in the 1st century. And you're going to notice some things today about pandemics. And if you notice something, by all means, notice those observations. We're going to talk about those and talk about our follow-up work after this lesson. So way back in the 1st century, the very first pandemic came to be called the Antoine Plague, also known as the Plague of Galen. This happened around 165 CE to 180 CE, and 5 million people died during this. It was brought to the Romans from the Near East due to the trades that were happening during that time. Our next pandemic that happened was the Plague of Justinian in the year 500 CE. And so we've gone a few centuries without having any pandemics, and all of a sudden this pandemic came about and killed about 30 to 50 million people during that pandemic. Most of those people were in the Byzantine Empire, which is part of the eastern part of Roman Empire. And it was caused because there were rats on the ships that the merchants used. And as you can see, that was a much bigger pandemic. Something to worry about at this point. Much wider spread, a lot more people died. Our next pandemic happened in Japan, where Japan started interacting with other parts of Asia. And so in the 735 approximately, the Japanese smallpox epidemic came about, and 1 million people died in that one. So it's kind of contained just to Asia, but it was not definitely a small outbreak by any stretch of the imagination. And then we get to our next pandemic. This one is one that many people know about. Did not happen until the almost the 1400s. So that would be all the way not until the 12th century. And that one's known as the bubonic plague or Black Death. And this pandemic didn't just last 1 year. It didn't just last 2 years. It lasted about 50 years. And during those 50 years, 200 million people were killed during that pandemic because they got sick with that bubonic plague, which is really unfortunate. I will be right back. Then our next pandemic was another smallpox epidemic, and these different epidemics happened, they cycled, and you'll start seeing that the same virus happened over and over again. This time the smallpox epidemic happened in the year 1520, and also was not very well treated. A lot of people got sick with smallpox, and 56 million people died due to the smallpox virus. It was eventually eradicated in 1967, so it took a long time for the smallpox vaccine to be made, but by being eradicated means that it was not found in human populations anymore. So they were completely able to get rid of the smallpox, which is why one of your vaccines that you get is to help control that one and to make sure that our population does not continue to get this disease, causing for another major epidemic of smallpox. During the 17th century, there were many smaller epidemics all going on at the same time. So during the 1600s, 3 million people died in England and especially in London. And so there wasn't just one strain of that virus getting to people. It was lots and lots of different ones that they grouped together as the 17th century Great Plagues. The 18th century also had plagues of its own. And just like the 17th century, the 18th century had many as well. There were not nearly as many deaths at this time. This time only about 600,000 people died. It started in Europe and left hotspots in Egypt and India. So it was mostly contained, but traveled throughout Europe, particularly, and a little bit of Asia area there. Then we get to our next epidemic. This one was called the cholera outbreak. And cholera happened during the early 1800s all the way through the early 1900s. And so that was happening during the entire time span due to trading, commerce, and people migrating to new places and being able to move to new places as well. And then in 1855, there was another epidemic. This one was much larger. There were 12 million people that died during this epidemic. And it is known as the Third Plague. And this is where I'm talking about that viruses spread, because this is that same strain of the bubonic plague. And we can see that has happened through time. Again, it began in China, but this one did spread worldwide. Our next pandemic was relatively small. It's known as the yellow fever. A lot of people got this during the late 1800s. And again, it was about 100 to 150,000 people. And we can't know for sure how many people died just because our medical records weren't as accurate as they were today. This one was transmitted by mosquitoes. That probably came from Africa and South America in the rainforest area. And it caused people to get a yellow tone in their skin called jaundice, which is why it became known as the yellow fever. In the very end of the 19th century, the Russian flu also took over. And again, only about 1 million people were affected by this one, rather died during this one. But this one was more detrimental to younger people than older people, because this strain was one that had happened earlier, and the older people they had found were more immune to this because a lot of them had been exposed to this virus in the earlier time of their life. So it really impacted the younger people much more than the older ones. And then the Spanish flu occurred right near the beginning of the 20th century, starting in about 1918. The Spanish flu had 40 to 50 million deaths, and it got its name because at the time, Spanish newspapers started broadcasting about the health and population in their country, which wasn't illegal. And so it got its name because they were the ones that most widely told others about it. It wasn't that it didn't go worldwide, because obviously it would have made a bigger impact by having that larger number of deaths. So it didn't just stay in Spain, but that's how it got its name. And then we had the Asian flu, also known as avian flu. And that one didn't happen until the middle of the 20th century, during about 1957 to 1958. Again, about 1 million people died during this pandemic. It originated in China and also spread worldwide. But as you can see, it was a much smaller epidemic. With advances in medicine, they were able to contain this one from spreading nearly as much. They believe that this one was spread by birds, giving it its name, the avian flu. In 1968, the Hong Kong flu occurred. That one had 500,000 cases within the first 2 weeks of those. But it spread long after those first 2 weeks. And in total, about 1 million people died from it. But that's how fast it could spread, was that in 2 weeks' time, 500,000 people got sick with the Hong Kong flu. And then one of our most prominent pandemics of the 20th century, and is still going on even today, is the HIV and AIDS pandemic. 25 to 35 million people have died because of it, and the AIDS pandemic really damages the immune system, making it hard to fight infections. So these people already had a weak immune system, so then once they got the epidemic, then they could not really fight it because their immune system was already compromised. Then, in 2002, a much smaller pandemic occurred. This one is known as SARS. And so, right at the turn of the century, SARS happened. There were only known 770 deaths due to it, but it was caused by a virus in bats that likely affected a cat, and that cat came in contact with the human, and eventually it spread from there. And you can see that that one is a much, much smaller epidemic. And you're going to notice as some of our upcoming ones, our upcoming pandemics, this one is fairly small in comparison. And you're going to see that that's because of advances in medicine, learning how to separate from one another, taking steps to wash our hands. All of those things helped to make sure that that virus really did not impact people as they went. Then, our next one was called the swine flu. This one happened not too many years ago, might have been when some of you were just being born. This one was in 2009, 2010. Some people know it as H1N1, which again is a strain that we have seen throughout history. This one again had the impacts to the younger population than the older, because again the older population had been exposed to it at some point earlier in their time, that particular virus or a strain of that virus. So it was very similar to one of our previous viruses. Then our next one started in 2012. This one is called the MERS pandemic. And again, it's a very, very small epidemic in comparison to some of our other time periods. And most of the time, this one impacted people in the Middle East, but spread because of traveling. So it was able to go worldwide, but most of those were in that Middle East region of the world. Next, we get to our next major pandemic that's been in our lifetime. Is called the Ebola pandemic. That one really took place in Africa, and got its name because the path it followed tended to follow the Ebola River in Africa, and about 11,000 people died during that one. And last but not least, we have our pandemic that we are in currently, the coronavirus or COVID-19. And we don't know how that is going to impact us, but what we do know is by washing our hands, staying away from each other, we're enabling there to be distance between people so that our pandemic can't start to grow in size, and each day that grows and grows, because if one person gets that disease and they sneeze or cough and gets those little things in the air, all the people around them. So now imagine one person in your family gets it, and now those germs are in your house. Now that goes to 4 or 5 more people. Those 4 or 5 more people come to school. That would give it to all the rest of the kids in our class. They take it home, and it just starts to multiply from there. So you're really at home right now in order to help keep those germs from getting to other people. So for follow-up work, here is what I want you to do. All of you I know have either stuffed animals or Pokemon cards at home. What you're going to do is you're going to take your stuffed animals, put them in a big pile, or your Pokemon cards, same thing, put them all in one big pile, and pick up the one on the very top, okay? That one touches 2 more people. And we're gonna record this and write it down so that we can look at our results tomorrow. So then if you had more in your pile, you would pick up that next one and see how many were that particular stuffed animal or Pokemon card touching. Same thing goes with the Pokemon cards. You take the top one, now count how many that one was touching. There's 2. How many are those 2 touching? That was 4 more, and we can see how pandemics are able to spread. So that is your follow-up work for this afternoon. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, and I will see elementary students live at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning.